At 3 a.m. on September 1st, 1983, a Boeing 747 belonging to Korean Air drifts through the darkness above the North Pacific, its navigation lights barely visible against an endless void of water and sky. The passengers aboard Flight 007 are halfway between Anchorage and Seoul, settling into the monotony of a long transoceanic night. To them, nothing feels unusual. The seatbelt signs glow softly, the engines hum with mechanical confidence, and the cabin crew moves with the quiet rhythm of routine. In the cockpit, the atmosphere mirrors that sense of calm. Yet beneath that facade of normalcy, the aircraft is drifting steadily off its intended course, an error so small at first that no one inside the cockpit perceives it, but one that will steer the flight directly into the path of disaster. Captain Chun Byung-in, a veteran with thousands of flight hours, scans the primary instruments with the relaxed vigilance of habit. His demeanor reflects experience, calm, deliberate, trusting in the sophisticated automation of the 747's Inertial Navigation System. Beside him sits First Officer Sun Dong-hui, methodically cross-checking fuel data and performance numbers as part of the climb phase workload. Behind them, Flight Engineer Kim Uidong monitors engine gauges and electrical loads, ensuring that each system performs within the expected ranges. To an outsider, the cockpit would look like a portrait of professionalism. But the seeds of catastrophe have already been planted, not through negligence or incompetence, but through a subtle chain of assumptions, distractions, and lapses in communication that undermine the principles of crew resource management. The flight had departed Anchorage hours earlier amid a flurry of nighttime operational tasks, navigation updates, departure clearances, performance recalculations. It was the kind of environment where rushing could go unnoticed and where small deviations slipped past the radar of human attention. Somewhere in that brief window after takeoff, the aircraft's inertial navigation system appears not to have been properly engaged. Instead of locking onto the programmed route, the aircraft continued to fly a compass heading that slowly diverged from the intended track. It was an error that demanded only a brief glance at cross-track deviations to catch. Yet as the great jet thundered westward, no one verbalized the drift or questioned the lack of expected waypoints passing beneath them. The night sky around them was vast and unforgiving. Out here, navigation relied not on external visual cues, but on a system of coordinates invisible to the human eye. The aircraft was supposed to be following the designated route known as R-20, a well-established airway hugging the boundary of Soviet airspace, but remaining safely outside it. For years, commercial flights had passed through this region without incident, but the margin for error was razor-thin. A deviation of only a few degrees over several hours was enough to unknowingly cross into one of the most heavily guarded and politically sensitive areas on Earth. As the flight settled into cruise altitude at 35,000 feet, the crew's workload eased into the familiar rhythm of long-haul operations. The cockpit lights dimmed. Radios crackled intermittently. Autopilot held the aircraft steady, but within this bubble of routine, something crucial was missing: the constant cross-verification required to ensure the aircraft remained precisely on course. The quiet environment and smooth conditions became a double-edged sword, creating a false sense of security that dulled vigilance. Without turbulence, weather deviations, or warnings from navigation systems, the crew's minds shifted toward the monotony of night flying, one of the most potent breeding grounds for complacency. The passengers, ignorant of the encroaching threat, slept, read, whispered, or stared into the darkness outside their windows. Families returning home, business travelers, diplomats, students, each with their own destination, none aware that the world beneath them was shifting from international waters to a superpower's restricted military zone. In the cabin, flight attendants prepared late-night beverages, moving gracefully between the aisles, unaware that their aircraft's position was now offset more than a dozen miles northwest of its intended track. Inside the cockpit, the crew occasionally noted expected checkpoint times, but something vital was absent: actual confirmation of passing over those points. Due to the nature of the navigation drift, each estimated time appeared close enough, reinforcing a dangerous illusion of accuracy. The inertial system provided no immediate warning because it believed itself to be functioning properly. it could not detect an initial setup error. And so, the aircraft pressed blindly forward, off course yet entirely unaware of its trespass. Far beneath the 747's wing, the ocean gave way to the first signs of the Kamchatka Peninsula, a region locked in Cold War secrecy. Soviet radar operators monitored their screens, searching for intrusions that might signal reconnaissance aircraft or threats to national security. Civilian airliners typically skimmed the edge of their detection ranges, but remained outside restricted corridors. Yet on this night, the track of Korean Air Flight 007 appeared suspiciously anomalous, drifting towards Soviet territory at an altitude consistent with U.S. military aircraft. The operators took notice, but the blip's behavior lacked the erratic maneuvers typical of surveillance planes. Still, the presence of any unidentified aircraft in the region was cause for concern. In the cockpit of Flight 007, the quiet persisted. The first hints of dawn still hours away. The pilots monitored systems that showed no anomalies. Yet communication between them had slipped into a pattern of assumptions rather than active verification. Crew resource management existed to prevent this, requiring cross-checking, mutual questioning, and challenge response protocols. But CRM in 1983, especially within certain airlines, had not yet evolved into the robust standard practice today. Hierarchy, deference, and silent acceptance often replaced collaborative decision-making. It was within this cultural and procedural context that the flight continued deeper into danger. The aircraft should have crossed the southern boundary of Soviet airspace without ever entering it. Instead, it unknowingly penetrated it. Soviet Air Defense Command scrambled fighters to intercept the unidentified intruder. Their radar systems, hardened by decades of geopolitical tension, tracked the slow arc of the 747's deviation. The approaching aircraft flew at a steady altitude, constant speed, and unwavering direction. It behaved neither like a missile nor a maneuvering reconnaissance jet. Yet no civilian aircraft was cleared to fly this route, and the Cold War environment left no room for error. Flight 007's crew remained oblivious. Not a single alert sounded. No visual cues contradicted their assumptions. The aircraft's weather radar showed nothing abnormal. Radios remained mostly silent due to the vast distances over oceanic airspace. And the sheer monotony of cruise continued to erode the vigilance needed to catch the drift that instruments alone could not readily highlight. A fundamental principle of aviation safety, that automation must be continuously monitored and verified, was breaking down quietly, invisibly. One of the earliest signs that something was amiss occurred when the crew noticed a delay in reaching the expected waypoint. But instead of questioning the discrepancy aggressively, they rationalized it. Perhaps winds aloft were different than forecast. Perhaps slight variations in climb performance threw off earlier estimates. Without strong CRM practices to encourage open challenge and cross-examination, each explanation seemed harmless, even logical. And so, the mental model the pilots carried in their minds, the belief that they were exactly where they were supposed to be, remained unchallenged. Below them, Soviet interceptors were closing in. The distance between their radar signatures shrank with each passing minute. To the Soviet pilots, the 747 silhouette was at first indistinguishable, lost in the contrast of darkness and altitude. They did not yet know that this massive aircraft carried innocent civilians, not surveillance equipment. They only knew that an aircraft had violated their airspace during a period of heightened international tension, flying straight towards sensitive military zones. Yet inside the 747, tranquility persisted. Passengers shifted in their seats. Crew members poured coffee. The flight deck hummed softly with avionics. And the navigation error continued to grow, minute by minute, mile by mile, pushing Flight 007 farther into the unknown. The fatal chain was already in motion. A subtle initial error, a failure to cross-check, a night sky that masked every clue, and a cockpit culture that discouraged assertive questioning. The seeds of tragedy lay not in a single mistake, but in a constellation of small oversights that compounded silently. Each passing moment brought the jet closer to the point at which recovery would no longer be possible. Unaware of the geopolitical storm forming around them, the crew continued on a course that would soon provoke one of the most consequential airspace confrontations of the 20th century. The hours after takeoff slip quietly into the early morning darkness as Korean Air Flight 007 continues its unintended northern drift. With no alarms sounding and no external cues contradicting their expectations, the crew maintains routine cockpit tasks while unknowingly crossing deeper into restricted Soviet airspace. The ocean below, now replaced by the jagged outline of the Kamchatka Peninsula, offers no warning to the hundreds of passengers sleeping peacefully just meters away from one of the most dangerous borders on the planet. In the cockpit, the conditions remain deceptively calm. The autopilot holds altitude and heading. The flight engineer observes stable engine parameters, and the first officer notes fuel consumption within expected limits. Their mental model remains unbroken. The aircraft is exactly where they believe it is. Yet, this false sense of precision will soon collide head-on with military and political realities far beyond their control. Far to the north, Soviet air defense radars confirm the intruding aircraft's presence. Defense commanders scramble fighters in response, a standard protocol given the Cold War tensions that define this era. The Soviet Union has long suspected American reconnaissance aircraft of probing its borders, gathering intelligence on missile sites, submarine bases, and command infrastructure. A high-altitude aircraft moving steadily over Kamchatka in the early hours of the morning fits the profile of a potential threat. To them, the radar return does not resemble a harmless civilian jet. It resembles a potential spy plane. Soviet pilots begin the climb into the blackness above the peninsula, scanning the emptiness ahead for their target. They expect evasive action from an intruder, but what they see instead is an aircraft flying perfectly straight at a civilian cruise altitude. Confusion begins to form among them. Why would a reconnaissance aircraft behave so predictably? Why would it follow such a steady path with no attempt to avoid detection? Yet despite this uncertainty, the mission objective remains unchanged: intercept, identify, and prepare to engage. Meanwhile, inside Flight 007's cockpit, the crew faces a subtle moment of cognitive dissonance. Their expected waypoint passage times do not align precisely with their calculations. It is the first real sign that something is wrong. But instead of provoking immediate scrutiny, the discrepancy is rationalized. Long-range flights often involve small timing variations. Winds aloft rarely match forecasts exactly. And with no external visual references, the crew has no reason to suspect a navigational error. The moment passes without action, and the chain of errors tightens quietly. Not long after, Anchorage Center attempts to contact the aircraft to request routine reporting. The vast distance makes communication difficult, but the absence of a response from Flight 007 raises an early concern. Radio contact over the ocean is inconsistent, and so controllers do not immediately treat the silence as an emergency. Still, their attempts to reach the aircraft continue intermittently. Each unanswered call becomes one more piece in a mosaic of missed connections and misinterpretations that will later confound investigators. Inside the cockpit, none of these attempts are heard. The crew scans radio frequencies occasionally, but the atmospheric conditions and distance reduce clarity to sporadic static bursts. They assume there is nothing unusual about the limited communications. After all, long stretches of silence are standard over the North Pacific. Without a clear signal telling them otherwise, they remain unaware of the increasing concern on the ground. As the aircraft continues deeper into Soviet territory, the interceptors approach. Through the darkness, one of the Soviet pilots finally identifies the target visually. The silhouette is unmistakable: a four-engine wide-body airliner, too large and too slow to be a reconnaissance aircraft. The pilot reports this finding to command, but the information does not immediately ease the tension. The military chain of command grapples with the contradiction: a civilian aircraft in a place where no civilian aircraft should be. Was this a deliberate intrusion, a navigational ruse, or a cloaked intelligence mission disguised as a commercial flight? While Soviet commanders debate their interpretation, Flight 007 exits the Kamchatka Peninsula and moves back over open ocean. The interceptors lose visual contact. Fuel constraints force them to return to base. For a brief moment, the aircraft is no longer under direct pursuit, but the event does not end there. The Soviet command, convinced that the intruder is probing their defenses, prepares to reposition assets farther along the expected track should the aircraft re-enter restricted airspace. They predict the flight's approximate vector and prepare for a renewed response once the radar signal returns. Back in the cockpit, the crew of Flight 007 remains unaware of everything unfolding around them. The subtle navigational error that began hours earlier has evolved into a full-scale deviation. Yet the aircraft still flies smoothly, with cockpit instruments showing nothing visibly incorrect. Human factors now dominate the scenario: confirmation bias, over-reliance on automation, and a lack of active cross-checking. These cognitive traps become more dangerous in long-haul operations, where fatigue silently erodes the sharpness of judgment. The first officer glances again at the navigation displays, expecting to see progress consistent with their flight plan. The displays do provide information: distance traveled, estimated arrival time, ground speed, but none explicitly announce, "You are off course." Without comparing these values against a verified inertial track reference, the drift continues unnoticed. In an environment where silence and stability suggest everything is fine, the absence of a challenge from any crew member reinforces the illusion of correctness. Crew resource management is designed to counteract such situations by encouraging assertive communication and mutual verification. But in 1983, CRM philosophy was still in its early stages internationally, and cultural norms often discouraged junior crew members from questioning senior authority. The cockpit dynamic aboard Flight 007 reflects this reality. Subtle doubts, if any arose, were left unspoken. Opportunities to identify the deviation passed quietly into the darkness. On the ground, Tokyo controllers prepare to establish communication with the inbound aircraft as it approaches the region. Yet when the expected contact window opens, Flight 007 remains silent. Controllers attempt multiple times to reach the aircraft. No response. They reroute transmissions, try alternate frequencies, and even coordinate with nearby flights to relay messages. Still nothing. The silence deepens the mystery but does not yet trigger alarm. In oceanic operations, such gaps occasionally happen. Unbeknownst to everyone aboard, the aircraft is once again approaching Soviet-controlled airspace, this time Sakhalin Island. Unlike earlier, when the interceptors lost contact after the aircraft exited Kamchatka, the Soviet military is now fully prepared. Radar systems track the intruder's re-entry. Fighter jets scramble again, racing through the night sky toward the target. But this time, the Soviet command operates under the assumption of deliberate provocation. To them, this second incursion cannot be accidental. The airspace around Sakhalin is a geopolitical powder keg. High-alert missile defenses, naval assets, and air patrols saturate the area. When the radar sweeps illuminate the 747, its course appears to be heading directly toward strategically sensitive zones. The Soviet fighters are ordered not merely to intercept, but to force identification. Protocol dictates that warning shots should be fired. But communication challenges, darkness, fatigue, and tense command briefings create a volatile mix. Inside the 747, the crew sees only the normal glow of instruments. No traffic avoidance alerts appear. The Soviet fighters approach from below and behind, staying completely unseen. The great jet continues its steady march forward, unaware that military aircraft are closing in with increasing urgency. The first overt sign of something abnormal arrives when one of the Soviet pilots reports visual contact, a civilian airliner with navigation lights illuminated. He communicates that he sees no aggressive behavior, but his commanders, interpreting the radar track as a threat, express doubt about this assessment. The tension escalates. Orders shift. Confusion ripples through the chain of command. In Flight 007's cockpit, fatigue begins to set in. The repetitive hum of the engines, the dimmed lighting, and the monotony of long-haul cruise erode situational awareness even further. The crew occasionally adjusts autopilot modes, checks fuel balances, and notes minor changes in weather radar. But the critical task, verifying lateral track accuracy, is still absent. The longer the oversight continues, the farther the aircraft drifts from safety. The Soviet fighters maneuver closer. One pilot attempts to signal by flashing navigation lights and positioning his aircraft where it might be seen by the 747's crew. But the angle, altitude, and distance make visual detection nearly impossible. A Boeing 747 cockpit sits far above the nose, and downward visibility is limited. The intercepting aircraft, flying at night with minimal lighting, appears virtually invisible from the airliner's perspective. Moments later, Soviet command issues a sequence of instructions that will become the focus of controversy for decades. The fighters are ordered to take action. They maneuver into a firing position as the 747 continues forward on autopilot, unaware of the impending threat. In the cabin, passengers sleep peacefully as the aircraft crosses the invisible threshold toward the final chain of events. The crew remains calm. Nothing in their environment suggests danger. They do not know they have crossed into the range of armed military interceptors, and they do not know that their lack of navigation cross-checking, compounded by gaps in CRM, has placed them in a geopolitical confrontation from which escape is becoming increasingly unlikely. The night is quiet. The aircraft is steady. The crew is unaware, and the Soviet fighters are now seconds from engagement. The night sky above Sakhalin Island is silent except for the distant roar of afterburners slicing through the darkness. Soviet fighter jets close in behind the unsuspecting Boeing 747, their silhouettes momentarily illuminated as they bank and reposition. To the pilots of Korean Air Flight 007, none of this is visible. The aircraft's tail navigation light glows steadily, its altitude unwavering. The cockpit remains a calm enclave of dimmed instrument panels and quiet breathing, unaware that their aircraft has now entered the climax of a geopolitical nightmare. Inside the flight deck, the crew continues routine long-haul monitoring. The captain and first officer exchange sparse updates on fuel and weather as the flight engineer logs system readings. Everything appears normal. The radio remains quiet, save for occasional static. No alarms sound. Not a single instrument shows a deviation severe enough to raise suspicion. Yet the aircraft is nowhere near its intended route. It has penetrated deeply into restricted Soviet airspace for the second time, an act interpreted by ground commanders not as a navigational mistake, but as deliberate reconnaissance. The chain of misjudgments on both sides narrows toward a single irreversible moment. Soviet commanders, already alarmed by the earlier incursion over Kamchatka, view this renewed intrusion as hostile. Their intelligence protocols warn that US RC-135 reconnaissance aircraft often operate in the area. Although the radar signature of a Boeing 747 should have differentiated itself from the smaller spy plane, confirmation bias takes hold. The assumption of threat overshadows conflicting evidence. In the cockpit of Flight 007, CRM continues to erode under the weight of routine and fatigue. Had the crew conducted a thorough position verification, they might have noticed the inconsistencies in ground speed predictions, waypoint timing, or fuel burn estimates. But the absence of challenge and response dialogue allows each discrepancy to be rationalized. Each missed opportunity silently pushes the aircraft further into danger. Human limitations, not mechanical failures, form the invisible net tightening around the flight. Below, the Soviet fighter pilot assigned to identification duty attempts once again to signal the 747. He positions his aircraft close enough to be visible, but night operations at high altitude complicate the effort. The airliner's crew likely sees nothing. The fighter's lights, kept dim for tactical reasons, are insufficient to draw attention. The Soviet pilot later reports making visual contact, seeing the aircraft's navigation lights, and even the passenger windows. But from the 747 cockpit, positioned high and forward, angled vision downward makes spotting a jet climbing from below almost impossible. The Soviet pilot radios his assessment. The intruder does not appear to be responding to signals. The aircraft is maintaining a steady course. It has not attempted to evade. This raises both hope and suspicion. Civilian aircraft usually avoid restricted military zones. But what if this is a reconnaissance craft intentionally mimicking civilian behavior? Soviet command deliberates quickly, shaped by Cold War paranoia. Radar displays show the aircraft heading towards sensitive installations on Sakhalin. With conflicting information and mounting tension, the order is issued: prepare to engage. Meanwhile, Flight 007 maintains its serene, almost unreal calm. Inside the cockpit, the crew focuses on the routine tasks of oceanic flight. They review arrival estimates for Seoul, check wind reports, adjust radio frequencies, and monitor engine parameters. No one suspects that armed fighters are positioning themselves in the darkness behind the tailplane. No radar warning system is aboard to indicate a lock-on. The 747 systems give no hint of danger. The Soviet fighters close the distance. The lead pilot receives final confirmation from ground command. The airliner is declared hostile. He interprets the command as an instruction to fire warning shots, a standard step in forcing an intruder to land. But the engagement occurs at high altitude, in darkness, without clear visual coordination. The pilot arms his weapons and prepares for a controlled burst. From inside the 747, nothing appears unusual. Passengers shift in their seats. The cabin crew organizes items for the upcoming breakfast service. A few individuals peek through shades at the faint pre-dawn glow forming on the horizon. It is peaceful, quiet, almost deceptively serene. Then the Soviet pilot fires. Two air-to-air missiles streak upward through the night sky. The first missile loses lock, veering away. The second finds its target, a massive, heat-rich signature at the rear of the Boeing 747. The explosion detonates near the aircraft's tail section, tearing through critical control systems. The shockwave reverberates instantly through the fuselage. Inside the cockpit, the crew feels a jolt unlike anything they have experienced. Warning lights illuminate. The aircraft shudders violently. Autopilot disengages with a command tone. Uncommanded control forces surge through the yoke. The captain's hands react instinctively, pulling to stabilize the aircraft. But the 747 is no longer responding normally. The explosion has severed hydraulic lines feeding key components of the tail, including the primary control cables. The horizontal stabilizer's ability to maintain pitch trims is compromised. The rear pressure bulkhead sustains damage, and the shock disrupts electrical systems. Vibrations shiver through the fuselage as the giant aircraft yawns slightly left. The passengers, startled awake, feel an abrupt dip. Loose items fall. Oxygen masks deploy in some sections. Panic erupts as the cabin lights flicker. Flight attendants brace themselves against the sudden loss of stability, shouting instructions to remain calm. In the cockpit, the flight engineer calls out system failures as caution lights spread across the upper panel. The captain and first officer fight to control the aircraft. They attempt to re-engage autopilot, but the damaged control surfaces prevent stabilization. The nose begins to pitch downward. The crew applies counter inputs, but the response is sluggish and inconsistent. The crew does not know they have been attacked. They interpret the symptoms as a catastrophic mechanical failure, possibly an explosion in the cargo bay or a massive structural malfunction. The first officer attempts to declare an emergency, transmitting blindly into the void of open frequencies. There is no answer. The aircraft continues to descend unintentionally, its tail authority compromised. For a few moments, the plane regains partial stability as the crew manually trims and manipulates remaining controls. Against incredible odds, they coax the aircraft into a marginally controlled flight path. But their altitude is decreasing and the situation remains dire. Passengers cling to armrests, eyes wide with terror. Some pray. Others scream as the cabin sways. The oxygen masks hang uselessly for many who cannot grab them amid the chaos. Loose objects slide along the aisles as the aircraft jerks unpredictably. The Soviet fighters observe the sudden descent and instability. To them, this confirms the intruder has been hit. But instead of disintegrating, the aircraft remains partially airborne. The Soviet pilot descends cautiously, reporting that the target is damaged and descending rapidly. Inside the cockpit, the captain instructs the first officer to find the nearest possible diversion point. Sakhalin airports are nearby, but the crew has no idea where they are. Their navigation is compromised. Their situational awareness has collapsed. They do not even know they are over hostile territory. They attempt to tune local navigation beacons, hoping to capture a signal, but the damage disrupts avionics. The aircraft continues to lose altitude. Control surfaces flutter unpredictably. The flight engineer announces hydraulic pressure losses. The captain fights the yoke, wrestling against a lumbering, wounded giant that refuses to obey. They attempt to stabilize the descent, but the aircraft begins to pitch nose down again. For a moment, The lights in the cabin flicker once more as the aircraft's electrical system strains under the damage. The structural integrity of the tail is weakening. The decompression adds mechanical stress. The engines still run, but the aircraft's attitude is erratic. The passengers brace as the aircraft rolls slightly. Screams echo. A child cries for a parent. Flight attendants cling to seats, arms stretched out to stabilize themselves. Panic consumes the cabin as the 747 descends through thinner cloud layers. The crew struggles relentlessly. They try every control input available. They use manual trim wheels. They attempt to stabilize bank angle, altitude, and pitch. But the aircraft has suffered mortal wounds. Its tail authority is nearly gone, and the aerodynamic forces begin to exceed what the remaining control surfaces can counter. The descent steepens. A final uncommanded roll begins as the aircraft approaches the waters off Monterey Island. The pilots make one last attempt to level the wings, but the 747, injured and unbalanced, surrenders to gravity and aerodynamic stress. The great aircraft plunges toward the sea. Passengers scream. The cockpit shakes violently. The flight engineer calls out altitudes. The captain pulls with all his strength, but the controls barely respond. Seconds later, the aircraft impacts the water with devastating force. The noise is indescribable. Metal collapses. The fuselage fractures. Water engulfs the cabin instantly. The impact is unsurvivable. In the darkness below the pre-dawn sky, the remains of Korean Air Flight 007 break apart and disappear beneath the waves. Above, the Soviet fighters circle briefly, confirming the loss of radar contact. The world beneath them goes silent. The impact of Korean Air Flight 007 with the cold waters near Monterey Island is immediate and catastrophic. The Boeing 747, already mortally wounded in midair, shatters upon contact with the sea. The colossal force of the crash rips open the fuselage, fractures the wings, and disintegrates the forward cabin. Darkness swallows the remains as waves surge violently over the wreckage. Within seconds, the surface is littered with scattered fragments, floating insulation, and small pieces of debris illuminated by the faint pre-dawn glow. No calls for help emerge. No emergency beacons activate. The violence of the impact leaves no possibility of survival. Miles away, Soviet radar operators confirmed the disappearance of the aircraft's transponder signal. Controllers in the region relay messages with urgency, but communication is muddied by the confusion of the night's events. High-ranking Soviet military officials conclude that the unidentified intruder has been neutralized. Their assumption is not publicly acknowledged. Instead, internal reports focus on confirming that no foreign military operation continues in the area. The downing of the aircraft is initially treated as a defensive necessity rather than a tragic mistake. As dawn begins to break, local Soviet naval assets are directed to inspect the crash zone. Patrol boats and surveillance vessels are scrambled toward Monterey Island under strict secrecy. Officially, their mission is reconnaissance. Unofficially, they are there to ensure control over the crash site before any foreign vessels arrive. The Soviet military has no intention of allowing international investigators, or even civilian rescuers, to approach. The political implications are too severe. The narrative must be shaped before questions begin leaking beyond their borders. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, air traffic controllers in Tokyo wait for Flight 007 to make contact. By the time the aircraft should have entered the Tokyo Flight Information Region, the silence becomes deeply unsettling. Repeated calls are transmitted. No response. Aircraft in the vicinity are asked to attempt relay. Each one reports back the same chilling result: silence. Concern evolves into alarm. Tokyo controllers notify Korean Air that Flight 007 has not made contact. Korean Air attempts to reach the aircraft directly. Still nothing. What was initially dismissed as a temporary communication failure begins to look like a catastrophic event. News travels quickly between agencies. South Korean authorities seek clarification. U.S. military stations in Japan begin analyzing radar data. The FAA receives fragmented reports of an unidentified aircraft crossing Soviet airspace earlier that night. Connecting these dots sparks dread, but no one wants to assume the worst, not yet. Back near Monterey Island, Soviet ships reach the crash zone. The water is littered with small debris, but the absence of large fuselage sections is striking. Bodies do not surface. Seats are not found. Luggage is almost entirely absent. The very nature of the debris field suggests a high-energy impact. The Soviets begin collecting fragments under the veil of military classification. As diverse search, restrictions tighten. Orders dictate that all materials must be retained and secured. Nothing is to fall into international hands. The Soviet government releases no public statements. The world still does not know what has happened. By mid-morning, U.S. intelligence agencies begin suspecting a shoot-down. Satellite data, radar traces, and intercepted communications hint at a confrontation. The Pentagon prepares briefings. The geopolitical tension is palpable. If a civilian aircraft has been shot down, the consequences could be enormous. Back in Seoul, families gather at the airport awaiting the arrival of Flight 007. As the scheduled landing time passes without updates, anxiety turns to quiet panic. Airline representatives provide minimal information. They simply do not have answers. Rumors begin to spread through the crowd. Some passengers had family members on board, diplomats, students, business travelers, children. The waiting becomes unbearable. In the crash zone, Soviet salvage vessels continue their work. Debris is sorted, cataloged, and transported under heavy guard. The search, however, is selective. Certain areas remain intentionally unexamined. The priority is not to recover evidence for safety investigation. It is to manage political exposure. The downing of a civilian airliner during peacetime would trigger global outrage, and the Soviet Union is determined to control the narrative. Hours later, U.S. and Japanese search and rescue aircraft are deployed. They fly over international waters west of Sakhalin, scanning for signs of the missing 747. But their searches are restricted by Soviet territorial boundaries. The most relevant coordinates, the actual crash site, are inaccessible. Fleets of rescue helicopters fly patterns over the open ocean, broadcasting emergency frequencies, hoping for any signal. They find nothing, not even a fragment large enough to identify conclusively. Back in Washington, intelligence analysts decipher radio messages intercepted earlier in the night. Certain coded transmissions indicate an intercept and an engagement. These classified communications strongly imply that the aircraft was mistakenly identified as a military threat. The implications are horrifying. A civilian aircraft carrying families, diplomats, and crew may have been shot down without warning. U.S. officials begin drafting statements. Diplomatic channels are quietly activated. At the same time, Korean Air dispatches representatives to assist families and gather information. The airline sifts through flight data, manifests, and dispatch communications, seeking clues. The flight plan reaffirms that Flight 007 should never have been anywhere near Soviet airspace. This discrepancy raises critical questions about navigation, crew awareness, and the line between human error and geopolitical catastrophe. As pressure mounts, the Soviet Union releases its first public acknowledgement. They report the presence of an unidentified aircraft over their airspace, describing it as a trespasser. They do not confirm a shoot-down. Instead, they emphasize national security concerns and imply the aircraft ignored warnings. Their language is evasive, crafted to deflect blame and maintain plausible deniability. International outrage grows as suspicions solidify. Families still wait for confirmation. News outlets begin reporting on the possibility that Flight 007 was downed by Soviet forces. Crowds gather outside embassies and airline offices, desperate for answers. Each hour that passes without transparency fuels global condemnation. Meanwhile, inside the Soviet military, internal reports circulate rapidly. The fighters' accounts, radar logs, and command decisions begin to paint a coherent picture, one that aligns with the external intelligence assessments. The aircraft was indeed misidentified. Warning shots may not have been visible. Communications were never received by the 747, and the Soviet pilot's perception of evasive behavior may have been influenced by radar limitations rather than reality. Yet none of this is shared publicly. International search efforts continue despite the absence of wreckage. The U.S. sends naval vessels closer to the region, gathering oceanographic data and scanning with sonar. but access to the likely crash site remains blocked by Soviet patrols. The tension escalates. The world watches as the Cold War casts its darkest shadow over innocent passengers. Days pass. Debris begins washing up on Japanese coastlines. Small fragments of plastic, insulation, seat cushions. Nothing large, nothing that tells the full story. But the presence of these fragments confirms what everyone fears. Flight 007 has been lost at sea. Recovery teams analyze the fragments available. The condition of the debris suggests an extreme impact event. Forensic experts determined that the aircraft did not glide or ditch. It struck the water at high speed. This aligns with the theory of structural failure or loss of control before impact. Still, without access to the main wreckage, the truth remains obscured. The International Civil Aviation Organization requests cooperation from the Soviet Union. Access is denied. The global investigation stalls. The Soviet government releases increasingly defensive statements, accusing the aircraft of espionage. The narrative becomes entangled in propaganda as each side seeks to protect its geopolitical posture. Back in the United States, intelligence agencies deepen their assessment. Satellite imagery confirms Soviet salvage operations near Monoran Island. Intercepted communications suggest efforts to recover black boxes. Rumors circulate that the Soviets have retrieved critical evidence, including the cockpit voice recorder, but refuse to disclose its contents. Every new piece of intelligence raises new questions. Why did Flight 007 deviate from its route? How did the crew fail to notice the error? Why did communication gaps persist? And why did a military force respond with lethal action instead of identification? Behind closed doors, aeronautical engineers and safety experts begin constructing theoretical models. They analyze the capabilities of the 747's Inertial Navigation System and recreate potential engagement scenarios. Their models conclude that the aircraft's deviation could be explained by a failure to activate INS navigation properly after leaving anchorage, a human error, not mechanical failure. But without access to the black boxes, confirmation remains impossible. Meanwhile, families of the victims hold vigils across Seoul, Tokyo, and New York. Photographs are placed on boards. Candles illuminate public squares. The grief is profound, compounded by the absence of remains. Closure seems impossible. Their loved ones vanished into a geopolitical conflict they never chose. The international community demands answers. Diplomatic channels grow strained. Accusations escalate. Conferences are convened. Press briefings erupt. The tragedy becomes a symbol of Cold War mistrust and human vulnerability at the intersection of aviation and geopolitics. Yet beneath the political storm lies the forensic core of the disaster. A chain of human errors, misinterpretations, CRM failures, misidentification, and miscommunication, each reinforcing the next until they culminated in unthinkable tragedy. The full truth remains buried beneath the waters of Monoran Island. In the weeks following the disappearance of Korean Air Flight 007, the world becomes gripped by confusion, grief, and geopolitical tension. With no access to the crash site and no cooperation from the Soviet Union, investigators struggle to piece together the truth using fragments of wreckage, radar data, intercepted communications, and the limited information released through diplomatic channels. The absence of the flight recorders, both the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder, creates a vacuum that is quickly filled by speculation. Yet amid the uncertainty, forensic investigators begin assembling the mosaic of events that led to one of the most consequential tragedies in aviation history. International pressure mounts against the Soviet Union. After days of denial, partial admissions, and conflicting statements, Soviet officials finally acknowledged that one of their military aircraft did indeed engage and fire upon an unidentified intruder. They claim, however, that the aircraft ignored repeated warnings and maneuvers designed to force it to land. But their account is fragmented, defensive, and inconsistent with independent analyses. As days turn to weeks, the Soviet Union continues salvage operations near Monoran Island while preventing international observers from entering the area. The International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, steps forward to lead an independent investigation. Their initial findings focus on reconstructing the navigation sequence of the flight. Using radar traces from Japanese and American stations, investigators determined that Flight 007 deviated steadily to the north throughout its journey from Anchorage, eventually entering restricted Soviet airspace twice, first over Kamchatka, then over Sakhalin Island. The deviation was not abrupt. It was linear, consistent, and continuous. This suggests not a deliberate maneuver, but a navigation error initiated early in the flight and never corrected. Investigators examined the Boeing 747's Inertial Navigation System, a highly advanced tool for its time, but entirely dependent on correct initialization. If the crew inadvertently skipped a step or misentered a coordinate, the aircraft could have flown on heading mode while the crew believed it was in INS navigation. Without cross-checking system indications, the drift might have remained invisible. The reconstructed path aligns with exactly that scenario. Attention turns to the human factors inside the cockpit, the subtle erosion of vigilance, the lack of CRM communication protocols, and the failure to challenge assumptions. Investigators highlight that the expected waypoint confirmations never occurred. There were no verbal call-outs questioning the absence of overflight indicators. The crew did not compare distance-to-go metrics against expected times. These oversights reflect a deeper cultural pattern of hierarchical cockpit dynamics, where junior crew members rarely second-guessed the captain's assumptions. The ICAO report later states that proper cross-checking would have revealed the deviation early enough to prevent the intrusion into Soviet airspace. But navigation errors alone do not explain the tragedy's final outcome. Investigators must also address the geopolitical context. At the height of the Cold War, Soviet defenses operated under intense suspicion. Their radar systems were often calibrated to detect American reconnaissance aircraft, and their protocols emphasized immediate response to unidentified intruders. When Flight 007 drifted into their restricted zones, the Soviets interpreted it as intentional provocation. Their radars lacked the resolution to distinguish a Boeing 747 from a smaller reconnaissance aircraft at long distances. This misidentification set the stage for fatal decisions. The ICAO investigation struggles to access the flight recorders, which remain in Soviet possession for months before being quietly handed over in 1993, 10 years after the event. When the black boxes finally become available, their contents confirm what investigators already suspected. The crew never realized they were off course. The cockpit voice recorder reveals no indication of confusion or awareness of danger. There is no discussion of Soviet interceptors, no acknowledgement of warning shots, no hint of distress until systems fail after the missile strike. The final minutes reflect a crew responding to a catastrophic mechanical failure, unaware of its origin. The flight data recorder provides essential information. The aircraft maintained stable cruise performance until the moment of the missile impact. The data corroborates that the aircraft never attempted evasive maneuvers, never altered speed or altitude in a manner consistent with intentional provocation. It was operating as a civilian jet, not a reconnaissance platform. Armed with this information, ICAO concludes that the downing of Flight 007 was the result of a chain of failures across three domains: navigation errors in the cockpit, misidentification and miscommunication by Soviet defense forces, and the absence of international protocols to prevent the escalation of such confrontations. Yet one of the most striking findings of the investigation is the depth of CRM failure. The crew's acceptance of the autopilot's performance without verification reflects a systemic issue prevalent in aviation at the time. Without structured communication, challenge response culture, and hierarchical flattening, crews were prone to cognitive traps, confirmation bias, complacency, and over-reliance on automation. The ICAO report emphasizes that had CRM principles been robustly trained, the deviation would likely have been caught early. A simple question, are we actually tracking our programmed route, might have changed the entire course of history. The tragedy of Flight 007 becomes a catalyst for profound change. Aviation authorities around the world strengthen CRM training, emphasizing empowered dialogue, cross-verification, and shared decision-making regardless of rank. Airlines adopt mandatory waypoint checks, standardized cross-checking procedures, and stricter protocols for INS initialization. Oceanic navigation training evolves significantly. ensuring that crews understand the limitations of automation and the importance of human oversight. The geopolitical ramifications are equally significant. The United States and allied nations pressure the Soviet Union to release more information and to adopt new protocols for dealing with unidentified aircraft. The tragedy accelerates discussions about the need for global transparency in airspace monitoring. This ultimately contributes to the modernization of civilian, military coordination and the integration of more robust identification systems. But perhaps the most enduring legacy emerges just weeks after the incident, when President Ronald Reagan announces a transformative step: the opening of the GPS system for civilian use once fully developed. The goal is clear: to ensure no aircraft ever again strays unknowingly into hostile territory due to navigational limitations. This decision reshapes global aviation forever, enabling precise real-time navigation that dramatically reduces the risk of route deviations. GPS becomes one of the most important safety tools ever created for aviation. In the decades that follow, the memory of Flight 007 remains a solemn reminder of how thin the margins of safety can be when human error intersects with geopolitical tension. The passengers and crew who lost their lives become symbols of the need for both technological advancement and international cooperation. Each improvement to cockpit displays, each enhancement to CRM protocols, each upgrade to navigation standards carries a fragment of their story. The families who waited at airports for news that never came continue to demand transparency and accountability. Their persistence contributes to long-term efforts to release classified data, to uncover hidden details, and to promote international safety reforms. Their grief becomes a driving force behind aviation organizations that advocate for better training, better systems, and better communication across borders. As the investigation concludes, the final narrative emerges. Flight 007 was not a spy aircraft. It was not conducting reconnaissance. It was a civilian jetliner caught in a convergence of human error, flawed assumptions, technological limitations, and Cold War tensions. The crew did not knowingly enter hostile airspace. They were victims of navigational drift compounded by inadequate CRM. The Soviet forces, acting on incomplete and misinterpreted data, made a decision that should have never been made against a civilian aircraft. Years later, when the transcripts of the flight recorders finally become public, the world hears the calm professionalism of the crew moments before disaster. Their voices reflect confidence, routine, and complete unawareness of the dangers surrounding them. The abrupt silence after the impact conveys the finality of a tragedy rooted in misunderstanding. The story of Korean Air Flight 007 becomes a defining case study in aviation academies, military training programs, and international diplomacy. It illustrates how the smallest navigational error can escalate into a global crisis when communication breaks down and assumptions dominate reality. It teaches that safety depends not just on technology, but on people: pilots who challenge each other respectfully, controllers who verify anomalies, and military forces who confirm before they act. And so, the legacy of Flight 007 becomes part of the foundation of modern aviation. Each passenger lost becomes part of the collective mission to improve the skies. Each member of the crew becomes a silent instructor to the generations of pilots trained in CRM. Every fragment recovered from the sea becomes a reminder of the stakes. The tragedy closes with a singular truth: aviation safety is written not in manuals, but in the stories of those who never made it home. Every flight has a story, and this one, etched into the vast skies above the Pacific, left a lesson the world could never ignore.